IVM.
Hello and welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Sidharth Bhatia. At a time when the strong opposition is needed, the Congress party is at its weakest. What is more, after two successful national election defeats, it is now in the doldrums and unable to rejuvenate itself for the future. Most of its critics within and outside says it's because of a weak leadership, which of course is in the hands of the Gandhi family. Party leaders have asked for democratic elections and some reforms that will throw up new talent. Some senior congressmen recently formed a group of 23 people, very, very senior politicians, to press for these reforms. Manish Tewari, the Congress MP from Anandpur Sahib, is a member of this G3 group. Tewari, a lawyer whose grandfather was a congressman and a minister in the Punjab government, was himself a minister for information and broadcasting in the Dr. Manmohan Singh government. He is in the news now for expressing views different from the party on the government's Agnipath Scheme. Is he out to provoke the party leadership into confrontation? Is he working towards a bigger plan? Let's ask him. Manish Tewari, welcome to the Wire Talks.
Thank you, Siddharth. It's always a pleasure chatting with you.
So now my first question is a little upfront. What is going on between you and the Congress right now? You've been taking positions contrary to the party's stand and then saying these are your personal views. But then you also refuse to sign the party's letter about Agnipath.
Well, I think you need to put a couple of things into different baskets. So, first of all, let me start off by saying that I have absolutely no problem with the Indian National Congress, an institution that I have served for every waking moment of my adult life, now going back 42 years. So, for anybody to extrapolate that there are any differences, it is absolutely erroneous. Insofar as the Agnipath or Agnivir, which is actually a very melodramatic name for a tour of duty. In fact, something more modest would have suited my taste. As I do follow strategic issues rather carefully, now going back a couple of decades out of academic interest, I have discerned, and I've written about it also, that this is a conversation which now goes back to the time when General Sundarji used to head the Indian Army way back in 1986. So subsequently, over a period of time, various institutions within the government and outside have looked at this human resource reform from a very, very careful perspective. The Arun Singh Committee on Defence Expenditure did it in 1990. The Kargil Review Committee did it in 1999. The group of ministers did it in the year 2000. The Standing Committee of Defence in 2006-07 made this recommendation. The Sixth Pay Commission made this recommendation. After that, the Naresh Chandra Committee or the Task Force on National Security endorsed it. Then the Committee of Experts under Lieutenant General Sheikh Sir, if I get the name correctly, also recommended that this rationalization is important from a variety of perspectives. So therefore, in my limited understanding, and since I've written a book on national security recently, I thought that perhaps this is a reform whose time has come. It's obvious that the Congress party has taken a different view. And therefore, I can only say that this is my personal view based on my very limited understanding of strategic affairs.
There is a political dimension also. I mean, the Congress is the opposition, however afraid it may be and moth-eaten. And as a loyal soldier of 42 years, Wouldn't you go along? One. And two, you are a part of that group, which one could call a ginger group in a manner of speaking, which has asked for many other reforms, including collective leadership. Putting two and two together, wouldn't you say this is stepping out of line?
Well, first of all, as I earlier pointed out, Siddharth, that those two things are in two separate baskets altogether. Insofar as loyalty or sincerity is concerned, well, I don't think after spending such a long time in an organization or an institution, you really need to give a loyalty test every 15 minutes. That, to my mind, is a complete non sequitur. Having said that, I completely understand and I respect the party's point of view. Possibly they are able to see things in a much wider dimension than my limited understanding of the issue possibly can. And therefore, I have qualified it by saying that this is my personal view. And obviously, if there is an institutional view that does end up subsuming whatever personal views you may have. But I also do believe that in a democratic party and in a democracy, people and especially those who are in public life are entitled to a point of view. And I leave it at that. Insofar as the so-called group of 23, which is a colloquial nomenclature which has been coined by the media, the G23, for the lack of a better word, consists or was a group of people that came together 2 years ago with only one objective: to flag certain concerns which we thought were very germane, considering that we've not been very lucky when it came to winning elections. And each of them has spent a considerable time. I mean, some of them have spent over half a century in the service of the party. So therefore, there was no element of dissidence, or there was no element of rebellion, if I was to use that word, in the views which were articulated. And as I have pointed out ad nauseum over the past 2 years, that the letter was written to the Congress president, right, who obviously is the head of the institution. And therefore, if you do have concerns about certain issues, who else will you write to? And there is also a context. You see, in the August of 2020, we were, the whole world was reeling under the first wave of the COVID pandemic. I mean, there was no vaccination around. People were unable to meet each other. I mean, if it would have been a normal situation or circumstance, maybe we would have met the Congress president personally and articulated our views. So therefore, the letter was also a product of the times that we were living in at that point in time.
You have since met Mrs. Sonia Gandhi at her invitation, along with some others. Are you generally satisfied with the way the party and the president have reacted? And or do you think that they are part of the problem? Organizational elections are due in September. What if Mrs. Gandhi or Rahul Gandhi or somebody is re-elected?
Well, first of all, I do not believe, and I speak for myself, that individuals are a part of a problem. If we are facing a challenge, the challenge is actually accentuated or actuated by certain wider trends, which do not have their origin in what happened in 2014 or 2019. They actually go back a much longer time in history. And let me explain that to you. You see, ultimately, a national election is the sum total of your presence across the various states which make up the Indian Union. And if you were to go as far back as 1967, the Congress party, unfortunately, since 1967 has not been able to form a state government, though we've had a formidable national presence in terms of MPs getting elected from Tamil Nadu. But the fact remains that since 67, we've not been able to form a government in Tamil Nadu on our own and have always been in a coalition. Similarly, we lost UP and Bihar in 1990, states that we had been ruling for the better part of, let's say, from 1947 to 1990. Odisha similarly went in the year 2000, and Odisha used to be a very strong Congress bastion. Similarly, Delhi, which we governed for 15 years under the chief ministership of Mrs. Sheila Dikshit, we unfortunately are in a problem over the past 8 years. So therefore, under those circumstances, some of these issues or some of these problems even predate the presidentship of Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, right, who very successfully was able to put together a coalition in 2004 and again in 2009, and possibly gave this country a government which, at least in terms of economy and social peace, were the best years that India's had over the past many decades. So therefore, under those circumstances, this is not finger pointing at a particular individual. And when you talk about the Congress organizational elections, yes, there is an election process which is playing itself out. And as has been the norm, it's a process where you try and do things more by consensus rather than really have a contested election. So under those circumstances, we'll have to wait for this process to come to fruition. And as I earlier pointed out, it's not about individuals. It is about how we collectively address or collectively try and address the larger systemic issues which have been bedeviling us.
No, that was a good going back in history. 67, of course, even in Parliament, a joint opposition had, got a fair number of seats. In UP, I think the SVD ruled for a while. So, yes, and then Janata Party and then so many other things after 1989. But that's something in the life of a party, isn't it? And it kept on holding on to Maharashtra and so many other states. So really the problems, even at those particular years when things were going bad, were manageable. Suddenly what you see is a party which had 2 seats in 1984 gets 2 majorities back to back, and Congress just cannot get around understanding what's to be done.
Well, Sidharth, let me put it in this way. The tenure of governments generally in this country have grown longer than 5 years. Let us also not forget the fact that the people of this country gave the UPA 10 years also. And when the UPA came back the second time, it actually came back with a far greater number of seats than it had even in 2004. In fact, interestingly, 2009 was a very significant year from another perspective also. After a long time, we actually won 24 seats or 22 seats, if I recollect the figure from the top of my head, even in Uttar Pradesh. So therefore, the fact is that what has happened with the BJP in terms of its 2 electoral victories is not something which is out of the ordinary. Now, if you look at Delhi, Delhi gave Congress 15 years. If you look at Odisha has been giving Naveen Patnaik, term after term from the year 2000 onwards. Similarly, in Madhya Pradesh, Shivraj Singh Chauhan was given a 15-year term. Of course, this current spell of his is a bit of an aberration because it's against the electoral verdict which the people handed out in the 2018 election. So the point being that the cyclical trend of governments changing after 5 years, and even in the case of Punjab, Punjab gave the Akalis 10 years from 2007 to 17. So generally, if you look at it across the board, there has been an increase in the amount of time that people are willing to give governments to be able to deliver.
So are you suggesting we could see a surprise at the center sooner than later?
See, you never know. Again, going back to 2013, right? Now, the challenger to the UPA, of course, the UPA was being buffeted from 2010 onwards as a consequence of extremely reckless allegations which were made by the then C&AG in the form of his audit reports, all those presumptive loss figures, which ultimately came to nothing. But the numbers were so humongous that they ended up creating a perception which unfortunately we were not able to surmount. But notwithstanding that, Prime Minister Modi actually emerges as a challenger only in the May of 2013, a year before the 2014 general elections are supposed to take place. And if you go by what's been the Indian democratic experience, India is a country where people have learned to exercise their choice. So therefore, what I was saying is that if Indians have learned to exercise their choice decisively when it comes to the ballot box, and they generally tend to keep quiet before that. And the classical illustration was, the AAP victory in Punjab. I mean, nobody anticipated that the mandate is going to be, so humongous. So really to say that 2024 is a done deal for the BJP, which is the current perception, I would be a little circumspect and cautious about that.
So maybe the media, maybe all kinds of other elements did create an impression that part of the problem with the group, your group, I come back to it was a personal pique being left out in the cold. And, one of your colleagues has already joined the Samajwadi Party to get back to the Rajya Sabha. Mr. Kapil Sibal. So, was there any element of that? And to be very honest, I'm going to conclude that question with part 2 of my question, which is, would you then consider joining another party? Because someone like you, people would want.
Look, Sidharth, number one, to answer your question sequentially, if there would have been an element of personal aspiration, then people would have generally kept quiet. Because let's not forget the fact that one of the signatories on that letter, Mr. Ghulam Nabi Azad, was the sitting leader of opposition. The other signatory was the deputy leader in the Rajya Sabha. A couple of us, had 4 years of our Lok Sabha term remaining. There was no need for us to really go down that road, except that we felt that there are certain issues which deserve to be flagged, and which, as I earlier pointed out, was the only objective. And to answer your second question, I've been asked this repeatedly since the August of 2020 that is this a pathway out of the party? And my stock answer has been, and I'll repeat it to you, that after having spent 42 years, I consider it to be demeaning to really be answering this question also. Of course, politics is about the preponderance of probabilities, and nobody knows what tomorrow or what the future holds for you. But having said that, if you go by my past track record, I think I have been very consistent with the Congress party, and that speaks for itself.
But have you been wooed by anybody? Are you being wooed?
Well, you see, this is not some kind of flirtation that you engage in, that somebody tries to woo you and, you do some kind of a step dance with them. I think politics is far too serious, for that kind of frivolity. If at all, at least I would say that for myself, if at all, I have to make a choice, I would think very, very deeply about it. Because, you see, the reason for coming into public service is not only personal ambition. Some of us who are here are not here because we couldn't have done anything else in our lives. We actually, gave up fairly promising careers in terms of the fact that Of course, I do practice as a lawyer, but if I would have pursued it with a single-minded passion, things would have been different. But those were conscious choices which were made because we felt that, at least I felt, that there is a premium in trying to serve the larger cause. And let's not forget, when I came into politics in the mid 80s, as a young student activist after the assassination of my late father, who was then a nominated member of parliament, I cut my political teeth in the trench lines of the battle against extremism and separatism in Punjab. And that was the formative decade of my political existence from 1984 to 1995. And therefore, under those circumstances, when you have gone through that kind of a mill, very early in your life, it shapes you in more ways than one. And therefore, these choices are not choices which are made very easily. There is an entire element of your own ideological makeup, your own comfort with yourself, which I think is always at a premium when it comes to making such choices or decisions.
So, once a congressman, always a congressman, ideologically speaking.
Well, I think ideologically also the Congress has changed. So therefore, let's suppose if you try and put it in that bucket, I think that also would not be a correct characterization. And I'll give you an example. I'm someone who believes in the entire Nehruvian construct of secularism. That, a religion is a private space activity. Secularism means the strict separation of the church and the state. And so therefore, Indian secularism is not some kind of a continuum going back 1,000 years. It was a Western concept deliberately imported into the design of the Indian constitution by the founding fathers, because they knew that in a deeply religious and spiritual society, there had to be a sharp distinction between the church and the state. But then that is not the definition of secularism which the Congress subscribes to. The Congress, over a period of time, has held that secularism means sarvadharma sambhav, which is respect for all religions and faiths. And I respect that, right? But all I'm saying is that there has been an evolution. When we came into politics, or when we started out as student activists, socialism was at the commanding heights of the Indian economy. But in 1991, you saw a complete reset of the entire economic ethos of the Congress party also, because the entire world had undergone a dramatic transformation. So therefore, there is nothing which is really static. But yes, there are some core beliefs in humanism, core beliefs that, of live and let live, of not interfering in other people's lives. Those are certain core values which you kind of hold dear. And what really troubles me is when I see this atmosphere of bigotry, of hate, of manufactured hate speech with only one intent, to try and hurt somebody else. It really bothers me, because I think what we are missing out completely is that the world has forged far ahead. And as Donald Rumsfeld had once said, not everybody's favorite person, I think it was the Shangri-La dialogue in 2006, that, money is a coward and money goes to the safest harbor. And in India, if we think that social disharmony and economic progress can go hand in hand, we are living in a complete fool's paradise. And therefore, you've seen the economy, struggling and scrambling over the past 8 years.
We'll be right back after this short break.
Namaste, this is Cyrus Brocha. I am part of the government cancel culture program to remove rubbish off all the different streams available. So what we have is all the collected rubbish we put together on our show. It's called Cyrus Says. It's on IVM podcast. You have to watch it and listen to it. It's on our app. It's on our website. It's on the YouTube channel. It's on Facebook. There are many different ways. Don't bother me and ask me how. You have to find out. We talk to different personalities. Many of them are known. Some are just people we meet downstairs and invite them up for chai. But the point is, it's fun and it's very therapeutic. So please join in and listen to Cyrus Says.
Welcome back to the Wire Talks. So, which perfectly brings me to the point I wanted to ask, but you've already touched upon it. I'd like you to expand on this. Many of these hate speeches, mishandling of the economy simultaneously are coming from the Sangh Parivar. You live in Punjab, you've seen the Sangh Parivar over the years closely there, what they did way back. And now elsewhere too, you're a very perceptive observer. Is this something to be laid at the doorstep of this party, of this government, the BJP and the Modi government? Because they are the ones who have to handle the economy and they are the ones who look the other way while all these bigotry and hate speeches go on. And lynchings.
Sidharth, let me put it in a wider perspective. Going back now to 2010, ever since you saw the advent of social media onto the horizon, unfortunately, in the context of India, social media became the most unsocial media. It allowed for the amplification of all kinds of biases, all kinds of prejudices, all kinds of frustration, all kinds of hate, which was till that point in time not possible to actually put it in the public space. So therefore, the vitiation of the atmosphere is not something which can completely and totally be laid at the door of the current government, though of course they are very much culpable given that the kind of statements or speeches that some of their leaders make. But the fact remains that as a society, we need to very, very seriously reflect that was there so much of bottled up anger, of bottled up emotions, so much of negativity in us as a people that the moment that got expression, we have all become broadcasters without any restraint or responsibility. And that is not to rubbish the contribution of the social media. As someone who's handled that remit as the Information and Broadcasting Minister, who created the new media wing of the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, I do understand, the democratization of the public discourse which social media has brought about. But at another level, there has been, as a society, a certain kind of a revelation which we are completely unwilling to either go into or explore at any length. Coming to the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, well, again, no organization has only one dimension. And one thing I would like to say, and I say it with the fullest sense of responsibility, that during the years of militancy in Punjab, during the years of terrorism in Punjab, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the Communist parties of India, the Indian National Congress, and every other mainstream party actually played a hugely constructive role. So therefore, while there could be a certain dimension of an organization which you and I may not like for various reasons because we do not agree with their worldview, but that does not take away from the fact, and I have seen that era very, very closely, right, in the universities, in the colleges, etc. When it came to a convergence of national interest, I actually saw no difference between the approach of the Congress, the approach of the BJP or the RSS, or even the approach of the communists, because it became a clear battle between nationalism and separatism.
But when you mention the social media vitiating the atmosphere, you forget that during the Rath Yatra, there was no such social media around. And yet there was mayhem all over the country. So, and that came after the Rath Yatra led by Mr. L.K. Dbani. So, this party has a past record also, and this moment also, where the government looks the other way. Some of its own worthies, ministers and, the UP chief minister, for example, make all kinds of incendiary statements and pass laws. You can't let them off so easily.
Siddharth, I am not letting anybody off the hook, but as someone who has, done this cut and thrust for many, many years of my life, I have over the past few years, started taking a more detached view of things. And what you say is absolutely correct. The Rath Yatra did create an atmosphere of polarization way back in the 90s. But if I was to travel a little further back in time, the mayhem that we witnessed during the partition of this country, right? More so in Punjab, where 2 million people were killed between the July and the September of 1947, where more than 20 million people were displaced from their home and hearth. At whose door are we going to lay that crime? Because the fact remains that it requires two hands to clap. And so therefore, as a people and as a society, you see, India is unfortunately, and it is unfortunate that the partition of India took place, but India is not the first country which kind of, had to split in this manner. You look at Czechoslovakia. Czech and Slovakia actually split in 1992. I was there. I was president of the International Union of Students. But you didn't have the Czechs and the Slovaks at each other's throats. But conversely, if you look at what happened in Yugoslavia a year earlier, when the whole of Yugoslavia got unscrambled, you had everybody at each other's throats for 10 long years. So I think, what happens is that when you start looking at these things in binaries, you possibly at times close your eyes to the real problem. And the real problem that we need to address is that why, as a people, as a society, are we so resentful of the other?
Personally think as a politician, you're letting them off easily. You're being the lawyer here and the history student. So you think that perhaps one must take the deep historic view instead of looking at what Mr. Adityanath is saying and doing? The fact of the matter is that Muslims are terrified and cornered.
Let me answer that again, by giving a historical analogy, Siddharth. You see, out of the partition of India, there emerged three things. There emerged the Islamic State of Pakistan, and there emerged two conflicting visions of India. A vision which believed that India should be a pluralistic, inclusive society. It should be the sun in the sky under which everybody can prosper and thrive. And so therefore, and that is the vision which held the field from 1947 to 2014. There was another vision that believed that since we had a partition on religious lines, so therefore that partition on religious lines should have gone to a logical conclusion. So if you had a Muslim Pakistan, you should have had a Hindu India. And unfortunately, what you're seeing unfolding is that logic of partition playing itself out in India 7 decades down the line. It's unfortunate, but try and think about it. That's what is happening.
We know that, but the resentment against Muslims, of course, goes back far, far longer, as far back as Savarkar, and who proposed the new two-nation theory. But let's not go into history. The trouble of going back to history is then you get claims like the Taj Mahal is built on, is actually the Tejo Mahal, and, apologize for what the Mughals did and all that. So history is a little...
No, but interestingly, since you bring up the two-nation theory, again, if you were to go back into the past, Actually, the person who actually first articulates the two-nation theory is Syed Ahmad Khan, who was the Sir Syed, who was the founder of Aligarh Muslim University in 1870. And it was subsequently recreated in 1909 by Bhai Parmanand, and subsequently recreated in 1924 in an article in the Tribune by Lala Lajpat Rai, who belonged to the Hindu Mahasabha but was a tall leader of the Congress party also. It was subsequently recreated by Iqbal in 1930 during his presidential address to the Muslim League, and then by Savarkar in 1937, and then by Muhammad Ali Jinnah in 1940, and then again recreated by Savarkar in 1943. So again, if you look at the two-nation theory, the two-nation theory did not come about in 1937. There was a context to the two-nation theory which really stretched back in time all the way to 1870. So the two-nation theory actually precedes the partition of India by almost 77 years.
I doubt the RSS thinks of Sir Syed so much. And of course...
No, but these are historical facts. I mean, in the sense that since I have written about it, I have actually read every bit of what I told you in terms of the various people I referred to. And again, I do not make a value judgment, Sidharth, because eventually maybe that was the context of those times. It cannot be a mere coincidence that people on various sides of the religious divide were actually articulating the same thing, right? So, and it is not that their nationalist credentials were ever in question. I mean, Lala Lajpat Rai is today, even today, among the most revered leaders in Punjab. He lost his life fighting against the British when he was beaten charged during the protest on the Simon Commission in Lahore. So what I'm trying to say is that when we look at some of these things and then try and use them as weapons and instruments in order to polarize today, we possibly do not, or we tend to overlook the context in what these things were, these developments were taking place. And of course, there was the whole imperial plot of divide and rule, of trying to, play communities off against each other. I mean, it's no coincidence that in 1939, after the Congress ministries resigned, when World War II was declared by Britain on behalf of India, also that this entire two-nation theory with Muhammad Ali Jinnah at that point in time being in London, gets a sudden impetus. I mean, there's a whole body of literature which is available in the India Office Library and the British Museum if somebody was to go and visit it. I'm sorry, we went on a historical journey, but I think there is a need for sober people on all sides, irrespective of the ideological divide, to determine whether we will keep regurgitating the ghosts of the past, or there is a time to lay them to rest and to look ahead, because the world, unfortunately, has just left us far behind.
So France and England have fought several wars. France and Germany fought the other powers. My limited point here is that history will always give you, justifications, but you are a Nehruvian, and as a true Nehruvian, you know that history is important, but we should also pick up the right lessons from the history, and sometimes past grievances should be left behind and moved on.
I completely agree with you. I think, you mentioned that you came from Amritsar, right? And so let me tell you, when we were growing up, right, and we had lots of friends, whose grandparents or even parents, had come from the other side, from Pakistan during partition. But I never ever remember a single conversation about partition in my growing up years. Neither did my grandfather, neither did my grandmother. None of them ever mentioned partition. Of course, they were on this side, but we had relatives who had come from other side, from across the border. People had lost their lives. And it is only, very recently that I started hearing these conversations, because for that generation which had been afflicted by partition, they wanted to move on. They wanted to bury the ghosts of the past. And I think that's the instructive lesson for us, that, as you rightly said, that we need to look ahead. If you keep looking behind and trying to regurgitate every historical grievance and try and justify it, well, you will just end up in the dustbin of history.
I may just add here that you just mentioned an example, and the instance of seeing your own friends and near and dear ones. The same here, because I come from a partition family, and the one thing that was never talked about, not because they wanted to forget, but because they wanted to make new lives, was how they were treated. If anything, I only heard some positive aspects of the whole thing. So, yes, we should move on. Unfortunately, we have a society encouraged and abetted by very powerful elements that has suddenly far away from the incident, with absolutely no personal knowledge, with absolutely no personal experience, which has suddenly discovered that past grievances must be sorted. My last question. So, you are a student of strategic affairs. You've written extensively on it. I've read your columns on the subject and you have touched upon it, but I'd like you to elaborate what you think of what happened in China, with China and India, and what do you make of the fact that the government first denied and now says, keeps quiet about the fact that the Chinese are occupying 1,000 kilometers of our territory?
Well, you see, something has fundamentally changed in China with the accession of Xi Jinping to the presidency in 2012. It is not the China of Deng Xiaoping and his successors from 1978 to 2012. And the one question that we have not been able to answer, and this government has not been able to answer, that why did the Chinese do what they did? What was the provocation for them to come across the line of actual control in the manner in which they did in the April of 2020? And the fact remains that over the past 2 years, in certain areas, the Chinese seem to have been successful in changing the facts on the ground. So therefore, under those circumstances, the complete information blackout, the complete vacuum in which the rest of the country is with regard to the actual situation on the line of actual control is something which should worry every Indian. And I think we have an opportunity today, because in the unfortunate collapse of Sri Lanka, you also see the ubiquitous Chinese hand, because it is all those BRI projects which eventually led to Sri Lanka's debt getting to an insurmountable or an unsustainable point. And therefore, for India at this point in time, this is a golden opportunity to talk to its neighbors, Maldives, to Nepal, to other countries where there is significant amount of this Chinese investment, which is almost a debt trap, and to see whether we can make them reconsider some of the stances which they have taken. I think a call across the BRI universe, the Belt and Road universe, people are looking very, very closely as to what has happened to Sri Lanka, because they could really be next. So this is the time, if let us suppose China and India are competitors for space in Asia, this is India's moment of saying that, our model whereby we do not have these expansionist, grandiose visions, but we allow or we believe that we need to grow together, is something which is worth emulating rather than getting into the Chinese debt trap. So therefore, in many, many ways, this could be India's payback. for what has happened to us on the border. But to your earlier point, I think the government needs to level. It doesn't answer any question in Parliament with regard to the situation on the border. I think 43 odd questions of mine have been turned down because they say it is not in the interest of national security to answer it. For the last 2 years, you've not had a single discussion on China in Parliament, except for some statements by the defense minister and the external affairs minister. And this needs to change because what you keep hearing, even from BJP MPs who have raised it in the House, especially from Arunachal Pradesh, etc., that China is trying to change facts on the ground.
And do you think we have that vision at all?
Well, the fact remains that because of almost 3 decades of unprecedented economic growth, China has been able to build up a 5:1 power differential against India across the board. And therefore, under those circumstances, that is why I repeatedly keep saying that the challenges abroad are extremely portentous. You see, India confronts a landmass of nuclear powers which stretches from DPR Korea all the way to Iran. And they're all contiguously linked. China is at the center of that. So therefore, if we remain embroiled in trying to disrupt our social cohesion, we may end up getting very, very nastily surprised, because your biggest defense against an outside adversary is the strength of your internal cohesion, which unfortunately has been a casualty in the past 8 years.
And a strong economy, which also is no longer.
And of course, a strong economy. Because if China has been able to undertake unprecedented modernization of their armed forces, it is primarily on the back of a very, very robust economic growth, because it's the money which makes the mayor go around.
So finally, coming back to where we began, what's next for Manish Tewari, near term and long term?
Well, what's next is that I'm writing another book. So therefore, hopefully by the end of next year, I would be able to make another humble contribution to the public discourse of this country. And otherwise, I keep serving the good people of Sri Anandpur Sahib, where Guru Gobind Singh Ji Maharaj had founded the Khalsa Panth on the 13th of April, 1699. And it is my good fortune that the people have given me a chance to serve them. And that remains my foremost priority, primarily because they are the people who've really put me where I am. And so therefore, my commitment to them, my intent to serve them for the remaining part of my term, and see if they would consider me good enough to re-elect me, remains my priority.
I really meant what next for you politically.
Well, that's exactly what I'm saying.
In terms of a political future, 2024, you may not be an MP if things go the way they are going.
Well, in the sense, we'll cross the bridge when we come to it. 2024 is still 2 years off. And so therefore, as I said, politics is the preponderance of probabilities. You only cross the bridge when you come to it.
And yes, it is. It is the art of the impossible. But if the Congress party does not give you a ticket, surely you want to continue serving the people of Anandpur Sahib as an MP.
Well, I am a sitting MP, so therefore I cannot really countenance a situation. Why would my party want to deny somebody who has served the institution with sincerity and dedication for, as I said, 42 years now, a chance to represent a constituency which I had won in 2019 and was only among the 52 people who had won across the country.
Okay, but we'll see when the bridge suddenly comes ahead of us what happens. But till then, Manish Tewari, thank you very much. You are not a master politician and lawyer for nothing, and you know how to address questions. But it was also fascinating and interesting to discuss history with you. Someday we shall hear more about that. Thank you, Manish. That was Manish Tewari, old-time congressman and a Congress MP from Anandpur Sahib in Punjab. Also a columnist, author, and lawyer who practices in the Supreme Court. He gave us a roundup of what is happening with his own party, why he takes positions on certain things which are different, and he also spoke about the current political scene. We'll be back once again next week with another guest on the Wire Talks. Till then, from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the rest of the team, goodbye. You can check out this podcast and other interesting ones on the Wire website, the IVM podcast website, app, or wherever else that you get your podcasts. Goodbye from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the Wire Talks podcast team.
There's a quick survey to fill out on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It lets us know a little bit more about who's listening to us. And you know what? We're going to do a few prizes. So, we'll do a random drawing of maybe 10 people, and we'll send you all some swag. Remember, that's ivmpodcast.com/survey where you can fill out the survey. Hello. It's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Cock and Bull, Cyrus Meghnad, Shreyas and Abbas discuss Vijay Mallya getting sentenced to jail for 4 months and fined 2,000 rupees for contempt of court. On Ikka Dukka Economy, Abhinav explains how the fiscal credentials of the government work. On Smarter with Sid, Sidharth explains the difference and importance of time in the market versus timing in the market. The Wire Talks host Sidharth Bhatia talks to a history professor and secretary of JNU, Professor R. Mahalakshmi. The duo decode the ongoing Kali movie poster controversy. And on Marathi Khirki Tanda Deshmukh's recite Marathi writer Purushottam Shivram Rege's poem, Anpahat Hota. Before I leave, I just want to remind you all that we have some amazing merchandise for you guys. Please go to our website, click on the shop tab, and check out the collection of t-shirts. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Don't forget to rate us on any other platforms you're listening to us. And remember, you can also check us out on YouTube. We're also doing a small listener survey which helps us understand who you all are, our listeners. And we'd really appreciate it if you could spare a few minutes to fill it out. It helps us build better shows for you. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Boat Lifestyle, Small Case, Capgemini, and Intel vPro. Thank you so much for making this possible.